Wind down tonight with a sleep story designed to calm your thoughts and ease you gently into deep rest. This 80-minute video explores why modern people would struggle to survive in the medieval world, weaving together tales of daily hardships, forgotten survival skills, and the resilient spirit of people who lived through one of history's most challenging periods. Whether you're seeking sleep, meditation, adult relaxation, or simply a peaceful journey into the past, let these stories guide you into serene rest. The Middle Ages stretched across nearly 1,000 years of European history, from roughly the 5th century to the 15th century. This era, often called the medieval period, represents a time so vastly different from our own that the very foundations of daily existence would challenge even the hardiest modern person. Imagine stepping through a doorway in time and finding yourself in a medieval village on a cold autumn morning. The year is 1320, and you stand at the edge of a muddy lane surrounded by simple wooden buildings with thatched roofs. The air carries scents unfamiliar and overwhelming to modern senses. Wood smoke mingles with the smell of animals, unwashed bodies, and the earthy odor of the fields beyond the village walls. Before you take your first steps into this world, you would already face challenges that might seem insurmountable. Your modern immune system, accustomed to antibiotics and vaccines, would encounter diseases your body has never known. Your skin, softened by indoor living and modern hygiene, would crack and bleed from the rough work demanded of everyone in this society. Your muscles, perhaps exercised at a gym or strengthened by occasional sports, would fail you after hours of the grinding physical labor that defined medieval existence. The medieval world operated by rules and realities entirely alien to modern experience. Understanding why you wouldn't last requires examining not just the obvious dangers of disease and violence, but the countless small challenges that would accumulate day after day until they broke even the strongest person from our time. Let us explore these challenges together, moving through the layers of medieval life that would test every aspect of your modern existence. The first challenge you would face in the medieval world would assault your senses long before it threatened your health. Medieval people lived in conditions that would horrify anyone accustomed to modern sanitation and cleanliness. This wasn't because they were ignorant or careless, but because the very concept of hygiene, as we understand it, simply didn't exist in their world. In a typical medieval village, human and animal waste accumulated in the streets throughout the day. Pigs, chickens, and geese wandered freely, adding their contributions to the muck underfoot. Most homes kept animals on the ground floor during winter months, with families sleeping in the loft above, separated from their livestock by nothing more than wooden planks. The warmth from the animals helped people survive the bitter cold, but the smell and the constant presence of fleas, lice, and other parasites created living conditions almost unimaginable today. Water sources that served entire communities often became contaminated with waste from upstream users. Rivers and streams received refuse from homes, workshops, and even tanneries that processed leather using urine and animal brains. People drew their drinking water from these same sources, boiled it if they had fuel to spare, but more often consumed it as it came from the river. The prevalence of ale and weak beer in the medieval diet existed partly because the fermentation process made these beverages safer than water. Personal cleanliness followed patterns very different from modern standards. Most medieval people might bathe a few times per year at most, often only before major religious festivals. This wasn't laziness, but practical necessity. Heating water required precious fuel, usually wood that had to be gathered, purchased, or carefully rationed from limited supplies. Privacy for bathing didn't exist for most people. Large families shared single-room dwellings where every activity from cooking to sleeping to intimate relations occurred in the same space. Your modern body, accustomed to daily showers and frequent hand-washing, would react badly to this new reality. Within days, your skin would become irritated and inflamed. Within weeks, you would likely host populations of lice in your hair and fleas in your clothing. These parasites weren't just uncomfortable. They carried diseases including typhus and plague. Your scratching would create wounds that, in the absence of antibiotics and proper wound care, could easily become infected. Clothing presented another hygiene challenge that modern people rarely consider. Medieval garments, typically made from wool or linen, were rarely washed. The labor required to wash clothes by hand in cold water with harsh soap made from wood ash and animal fat meant that most people owned only one or two sets of clothing. These garments were worn continuously, day and night, until they literally fell apart. The oils from unwashed bodies, combined with sweat, dirt, and the various substances people encountered during their work, made medieval clothing stiff, discolored, and alive with microscopic inhabitants. The psychological impact of living in such conditions would weigh heavily on a modern person. The constant itching from insect bites, the pervasive odors that never fade, the feeling of never being truly clean would erode mental health day by day. Medieval people, having known nothing different, adapted to these conditions. But you, carrying memories of hot showers, clean sheets, and the fresh smell of laundered clothes, would find this adaptation nearly impossible. Even if you somehow adapted to medieval hygiene standards, the challenge of obtaining adequate nutrition would test your survival in ways both immediate and insidious. The medieval diet, shaped by agricultural limitations, preservation methods, and social class, bore almost no resemblance to modern eating patterns. For the vast majority of medieval people, daily meals centered on bread and pottage. Bread, when available, was dark, heavy, and coarse, made from whatever grains could be grown locally. Wheat flour, reserved for the wealthy, rarely appeared on peasant tables. Instead, bread came from rye, barley, oats, or mixtures of available grains. The bread was often hard enough to require soaking in liquid before eating, and it frequently contained bits of stone from the grinding process that wore down teeth over time. Pottage, a thick stew or porridge, formed the foundation of most meals. This dish consisted of whatever could be thrown into a pot and boiled. Dried peas or beans provided the base, supplemented by onions, leeks, and cabbage when available. On fortunate days, a small piece of salted pork or a ham bone might flavor the pottage. More often, people ate their pottage plain, perhaps with a bit of butter or cheese if the cows or goats had provided that week. The same pot of pottage might simmer over the fire for days, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed, creating a perpetual stew that was never quite fresh and never quite spoiled. Fresh meat appeared rarely on peasant tables. The animals that peasants raised, their chickens, pigs, and cows, represented valuable property that provided eggs, breeding stock, and dairy products. Slaughtering an animal for meat meant losing all these future benefits. Most families reserved meat for special occasions, religious festivals, or times when an animal died from disease or accident. Even then, every part of the animal would be used, with nothing wasted. Vegetables and fruits followed strict seasonal patterns in the medieval diet. During summer and autumn, gardens might provide lettuce, onions, peas, beans, and root vegetables. Orchards offered apples, pears, and sometimes cherries or plums. But preservation methods limited which foods could be enjoyed through the long winter months. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut. Apples might last in cool storage until midwinter. But fresh greens, berries, and most other produce simply disappeared from the diet for half the year or more. This seasonal deprivation of fresh foods would have serious consequences for your health. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, affected many medieval people during late winter and early spring when stored foods had been consumed and new crops hadn't yet matured. Your gums would become swollen and bleed easily. Your teeth might loosen. Old wounds could reopen. Your energy would drain away, leaving you weak and listless just when the heaviest agricultural work of spring planting demanded the most exertion. The repetitive nature of the medieval diet would challenge not just your body but your mind. Imagine eating essentially the same meal of bread and pottage day after day, week after week, with only minor variations based on what ingredients happen to be available. Modern people, accustomed to diverse cuisines and readily available variety, would find this monotony almost unbearable. The psychological stress of endless dietary repetition would add to the physical challenges of nutritional deficiency. Hunger itself formed a constant companion for medieval people in ways modern people in developed nations rarely experience. Even in good years, food supplies ran lowest in late spring, that hungry gap between when winter stores ran out and when early summer crops began to mature. In bad years, when harvests failed due to too much rain, too little rain, early frost, or plant diseases, famine could strike entire regions. During these famines, people consumed things normally reserved for animal fodder. They made bread from acorns, tree bark, or even clay mixed with whatever tiny amount of grain could be found. Starvation weakened bodies, making people vulnerable to disease and weakened communities, sometimes leading to social breakdown. Your modern body, adapted to regular meals and consistent nutrition, would struggle terribly with medieval feast or famine patterns. The constant low-level hunger that medieval people learned to ignore would distract and demoralize you. The nutritional deficiencies would manifest in fatigue, difficulty concentrating, susceptibility to illness, and slow healing from injuries. Combined with the physical demands of medieval labor, these dietary challenges alone might be enough to break your ability to survive in this harsh world. If inadequate nutrition and poor hygiene didn't defeat you, the relentless physical labor required for medieval survival almost certainly would. Modern people, even those who perform physically demanding jobs, have little frame of reference for the grinding, dawn-to-dusk toil that filled every day of medieval peasant life. Agricultural work dominated medieval society. More than 90% of the population worked in farming, and this work involved tools and methods that multiplied the effort required for every task. Plowing fields meant walking behind a heavy wooden plow pulled by oxen or horses if you were fortunate, or pulled by other humans if you were not. The plowman guided the plow, while others drove the animals or pulled the ropes, everyone straining against the resistance of earth that hadn't been broken by machines. A single acre might require an entire day of this exhausting work. After plowing came harrowing to break up clods of earth, then sowing seed by hand, walking back and forth across fields while scattering grain from a bag slung across your body. Each of these tasks demanded hours of repetitive motion, bending and straightening, walking miles while performing coordinated movements. Your modern muscles, even if strengthened by exercise, would scream in protest. Blisters would form on your hands within the first day, burst, and become painful wounds that you would have to continue working through because the crops wouldn't plant themselves and survival depended on getting seed into the ground during the narrow window when conditions were right. Harvest time brought even more intense labor. Grain had to be cut by hand using sickles or scythes, tools that required specific techniques and considerable strength to use effectively. The cutting motion, repeated thousands of times per day, would strain your shoulders, arms, and back in ways that no modern exercise prepares you for. The cut grain then had to be bundled into sheaves, carried to a barn or sheltered area, and later threshed to separate the grain from the chaff. Threshing involved beating the grain with wooden flails, hour after hour, in enclosed spaces thick with dust that choked your lungs and irritated your eyes. Women's work, often overlooked in discussions of medieval labor, proved equally demanding though different in nature. Cooking over an open fire required constant attention and physical effort. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, often long distances, in heavy buckets or jugs. Laundry, though infrequent, involved heating large quantities of water, then scrubbing clothes by hand with harsh soap, then wringing them out and hanging them to dry. Spinning wool or flax into thread consumed countless hours, as did weaving that thread into cloth, all performed with simple hand tools that required skill, patience, and endurance. Child rearing added another layer of labor to women's already full days. Medieval mothers had no disposable diapers, no washing machines for endless loads of soiled clothes, no prepared baby food. They carried infants while working, nursed them while performing other tasks, and kept young children occupied and safe in environments full of open fires, sharp tools, and large animals. The constant physical and mental demands of caring for children while maintaining a household would exhaust even the most dedicated modern parent accustomed to labor-saving devices. Beyond agricultural work and household maintenance, medieval life required many specialized tasks that modern people have forgotten. Gathering fuel for fires meant collecting fallen wood from forests, cutting and hauling it home, and chopping it into usable pieces. In areas where wood was scarce, people collected dried dung from animals, or cut peat from bogs and dried it for burning. Making soap, tanning leather, preserving meat, brewing ale, making candles from animal fat, all of these necessary activities required specialized knowledge and significant labor. The cumulative effect of this labor would break down your body in ways both obvious and subtle. Within days, every muscle would ache. Within weeks, your hands would be calloused and scarred. Your back would develop chronic pain. Your joints would begin to wear from the constant stress. Medieval people adapted to this from childhood, their bodies hardened by years of gradual conditioning. But you, thrust into this world with a modern body adapted to very different demands, would find yourself physically broken long before you developed the toughness needed to survive. Even if you somehow adapted to the hygiene, nutrition, and labor of medieval life, the constant threat of disease and injury would stalk you every day. The medieval world was a place where a simple cut could kill, where common childhood diseases claimed lives regularly, and where epidemic illnesses swept through populations, leaving devastation in their wake. Imagine developing a simple infection from a cut on your finger. In the modern world, you might wash the cut, apply antibiotic ointment, and cover it with a clean bandage. In a few days, it would heal completely. In the medieval world, that same cut, contaminated by the omnipresent dirt and bacteria of daily life, could easily become infected. Without antibiotics, your body would have to fight the infection using only its own immune system. If your immune system succeeded, the infection might remain localized, causing pain and swelling but eventually healing. If your immune system struggled, the infection might spread up your arm, causing red streaks to appear under your skin as the infection traveled through your lymphatic system. Fever would set in, making you weak and delirious. If the infection reached your bloodstream, sepsis might develop, a condition that even with modern medicine can be fatal. In the medieval world, without any treatment except perhaps poultices of herbs that did little good, such an infection could easily kill you within days. Respiratory illnesses presented another constant danger. Tuberculosis, known in the medieval period as consumption, affected large numbers of people, spreading easily in crowded, poorly ventilated living conditions. The disease caused chronic coughing, weight loss, fever, and eventually death. No cure existed. People simply wasted away over months or years while remaining infectious to those around them. Influenza and other respiratory infections swept through medieval communities regularly. Without modern understanding of germ theory, people had no way to prevent the spread of these illnesses. They continued living in close quarters with sick family members, continued working in fields and workshops alongside infected neighbors, and thus ensured that diseases spread through entire villages. Your modern immune system, never exposed to the specific strains of medieval illnesses, would offer little protection against these unfamiliar pathogens. The bubonic plague, perhaps the most famous medieval disease, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in the 14th century. The disease, spread by fleas living on rats, caused swollen lymph nodes, fever, and in most cases death within days. No treatment existed. Entire families died. Villages were abandoned. The social fabric of medieval society nearly tore apart under the strain. While the Great Plague epidemics were mercifully rare, occurring only a few times per century, the fear and trauma they caused shaped medieval culture profoundly. Living with the knowledge that such a disease could emerge at any time, could kill you and everyone you loved in a matter of days, created a psychology of fatalism and religious devotion that modern people struggle to understand. Your modern mind, accustomed to believing that medicine can fix most health problems, would find little comfort in the medieval reality that disease struck randomly and killed without mercy. Injuries presented challenges nearly as deadly as disease. Agricultural work involved sharp tools, large animals, and dangerous processes. A kick from a horse could break bones. A slip while using a scythe could sever an artery. A fall from a ladder while repairing a roof could cause internal injuries. In each case, medical care consisted of little more than common sense, folk remedies, and hope. Broken bones, if properly aligned and immobilized, might heal well enough to restore partial function. But without modern surgical techniques or proper materials for casts, many broken bones healed poorly, leaving people with chronic pain and permanent disability. Wounds that bled heavily might be cauterized with hot irons, a treatment so painful that many people went into shock. Deep wounds often became infected. Amputations, performed without anesthesia and with unsterilized tools, carried a high risk of death from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Dental problems, which modern people address with routine visits to dentists, could become serious medical emergencies in medieval times. Tooth decay, extremely common due to coarse bread and lack of dental care, caused severe pain that people simply had to endure. Abscessed teeth could lead to infections that spread to the jaw or brain, sometimes proving fatal. Extraction of problem teeth was performed by barbers or blacksmiths using tools designed for other purposes, without anesthetic, and with little concern for the resulting pain or damage. Childbirth presented perhaps the greatest medical danger faced by medieval women. Without modern obstetric care, complications that would be routine emergencies today became death sentences then. Breech births, placental problems, infections, and hemorrhaging killed both mothers and babies at rates that modern people find shocking. Historians estimate that perhaps 1 in 3 women died from complications related to pregnancy and childbirth during their reproductive years. For every medieval woman, becoming pregnant meant facing a genuine possibility of death. Your survival in the medieval world would depend heavily on avoiding disease and injury because treating them effectively was nearly impossible. Every cough might be the start of a fatal illness. Every cut risked infection. Every pregnancy threatened death. The psychological stress of living under these constant threats, combined with watching friends and family members die from causes that seem trivial to modern minds, would wear away your mental health even if your physical health somehow held. Beyond the challenges of hygiene, nutrition, labor, and medicine, the simple reality of living exposed to weather and climate would test your survival in ways modern people rarely experience. Medieval buildings provided minimal protection from cold, heat, and damp. Clothing offered limited insulation. Fuel for heating was precious and often inadequate. Picture a winter night in medieval Europe. Outside, temperatures drop well below freezing. Wind howls around the corners of your small wooden house, finding every gap in the walls, every crack around the shuttered windows. Inside, a fire burns in the central hearth, but without a proper chimney, much of the smoke fills the room before eventually finding its way out through holes in the roof. Your eyes water from the smoke, your throat burns, but the fire provides the only source of heat, so you huddle as close as you can tolerate. The fire itself requires constant attention. Wood must be added regularly to maintain warmth through the long winter night. But wood is precious, gathered laboriously during summer and autumn, and carefully rationed to last until spring. If you use too much wood on cold nights, you may run out before winter ends. If you try to conserve wood by letting the fire burn low, you risk freezing. This calculation, this constant balance between warmth and survival, would occupy your thoughts every winter day. Even with a fire burning, the edges of the room remain bitterly cold. Frost forms on the inside of walls. Your breath creates clouds of vapor. Any water in the house freezes overnight unless kept very close to the fire. You sleep in your clothes, perhaps adding extra layers, and huddle under whatever blankets and furs you possess. Despite these measures, you remain cold for months, never quite warm, always fighting the penetrating chill that seeps into your bones and makes your joints ache. Modern people, accustomed to thermostats and central heating, to insulated homes and proper winter clothing, would struggle terribly with medieval winter conditions. Your body, used to maintaining a comfortable temperature through environmental control rather than personal adaptation, would suffer. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in response to repeated exposure to cold, would make your hands and feet ache and itch. Respiratory problems would worsen in the cold, damp conditions. Your immune system, stressed by constant cold exposure, would become less effective at fighting off the infections that spread so easily in winter when people stayed indoors in close quarters. Summer presented different but equally challenging conditions. Without screens on windows or doors, insects invaded homes constantly. Flies buzzed around food and waste. Mosquitoes bit during warm nights, spreading diseases and making sleep difficult. Fleas and other biting insects infested homes, animals, and clothing, creating constant discomfort. Heat itself could be oppressive in summer, especially when combined with the necessity of maintaining fires for cooking and other household tasks. Medieval clothing, designed primarily for warmth and durability, was rarely comfortable in summer heat. The long, heavy garments that protected against winter cold became stifling in summer. Yet modesty and social norms demanded that people remain covered regardless of temperature. Agricultural work continued through summer heat without mercy. Harvest couldn't wait for cooler weather. Hay had to be cut and stored during the brief window when conditions were right. You would work through blazing heat, sun beating down on fields where there was no shade, your heavy clothing soaked with sweat, insects biting any exposed skin, while your body demanded water that might not be readily available in the fields. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke affected medieval workers, though they didn't understand these conditions in modern medical terms. They simply knew that sometimes people collapsed in the heat and didn't recover. Rain and damp created challenges that persisted across seasons. Medieval buildings, with their thatched roofs and wooden construction, leaked when rain fell heavily. Possessions kept inside could become damp and moldy. Clothes, once wet, dried slowly in homes without modern heating. During rainy periods, which might last for weeks, everything remained damp. The dampness contributed to respiratory illnesses, joint pain, and a general sense of discomfort that modern people, used to watertight buildings and climate control, would find nearly unbearable. The cumulative effect of living constantly exposed to harsh weather would wear you down physically and mentally. The cold of winter would sap your energy and weaken your health. The heat of summer would exhaust you during the hardest physical labor. The damp of rainy periods would make you perpetually uncomfortable. Unlike medieval people, who knew no alternative and adapted as best they could, you would remember comfortable homes with controlled climates, would know that such comfort is possible, and would suffer psychologically from the loss of something you once took for granted. We have explored many individual reasons why modern people would struggle to survive in the medieval world. Poor hygiene and constant parasites, inadequate nutrition and seasonal hunger, grinding physical labor that never ceased, the constant threat of deadly disease and untreatable injury, exposure to harsh weather without adequate protection. Each of these challenges alone would test your limits. Together, they would almost certainly prove too much for even the most determined modern person to bear. But perhaps the most profound challenge would be psychological rather than physical. Medieval people, born into this world, knew nothing different. They accepted hardship as normal, suffering as inevitable, early death as God's will. They found joy in simple pleasures, in community celebrations, in religious faith that promised a better life after death. You, carrying memories of modern comfort, of medical care, of abundant food and warm homes, would find no such acceptance. Every hardship would remind you of what you had lost. Every day would be a struggle not just against physical challenges but against the psychological weight of knowing that life could be so much better, so much easier, if only you could return to your own time. This psychological burden, as much as any physical challenge, would be what finally broke your will to survive in the brutal Middle Ages. As we continue our journey through history, let us turn our attention from the challenges that would defeat modern people to the remarkable ways that medieval people actually adapted to and survived in their harsh world. Understanding their methods of survival reveals not weakness in modern people, but rather the extraordinary resilience and resourcefulness of our medieval ancestors. Medieval people survived not as isolated individuals, but as members of tightly knit communities where mutual dependence formed the foundation of existence. This interconnected social structure, so different from modern individualism, provided crucial support systems that helped people endure hardships that would overwhelm anyone facing them alone. In a medieval village, everyone knew everyone else. People were related by blood, marriage, or long association. This familiarity created obligations that went far beyond what modern people would recognize as neighborly relations. When one family's roof needed repair, other villagers contributed labor. When illness struck a household, neighbors cared for children, tended animals, and brought food. When a man died, leaving a widow and orphans, the community absorbed them, providing support that ensured survival even when individual resources failed. Agricultural work itself required cooperation on a scale that modern mechanized farming has made obsolete. Plowing heavy soil required teams of oxen or horses that few individual families could afford to own. Villages often shared plow teams, with different families contributing animals and labor according to complex schedules worked out through long tradition. Harvest time brought the entire community into the fields, working together to bring in crops before weather could destroy them. This collective labor meant that physical tasks, while still demanding, could be distributed across many people rather than crushing individuals. The feudal system, often portrayed as purely oppressive, also provided certain protections and support structures. The lord of a manor had obligations to his peasants just as they had obligations to him. During famines, lords often distributed grain from their stores to prevent starvation among their peasants. After disasters such as fires or floods, lords might reduce rents or provide materials for rebuilding. These weren't acts of charity but practical necessity. Lords needed living, working peasants to maintain their wealth and power, so keeping peasants alive served everyone's interests. Religious institutions provided another layer of support. Monasteries and churches collected tithes from peasants, but also provided aid during crises. They maintained basic medical knowledge, offered sanctuary to those fleeing violence, ran hospitals for the poor, and distributed alms to those in desperate need. The church's presence in every community meant that even the poorest people had somewhere to turn when family and neighbors couldn't provide enough help. This web of mutual obligation and support meant that medieval people rarely faced hardships entirely alone. Modern people, valuing independence and self-reliance, often lack equivalent support networks. A modern person transported to medieval times would struggle not just with physical challenges, but with the psychological adjustment to constant interdependence, where privacy barely existed and where survival depended on maintaining good relationships with dozens of people whose help you might need at any moment. Medieval people possessed vast stores of practical knowledge gained through centuries of accumulated experience and passed down through generations. This traditional knowledge, often dismissed as primitive by modern people comfortable with science and technology, represented sophisticated understanding of how to survive using only the resources immediately available. Consider food preservation, a skill essential for surviving winter months when nothing grew. Medieval people knew dozens of preservation techniques suited to different foods and circumstances. They dried fruit by laying it in the sun or hanging it in warm, dry rooms. They dried fish and meat by hanging it in smoky chimneys, where the smoke both preserved the flesh and added flavor. They salted meat and fish, layering it in barrels with coarse salt that drew out moisture and prevented bacterial growth. They pickled vegetables in vinegar or brine, fermented cabbage into sauerkraut, stored root vegetables in cool cellars packed with sand or straw. Each of these preservation methods required specific knowledge about timing, temperature, and technique. Meat that wasn't salted properly would rot. Fruit dried too slowly would mold. Vegetables stored in cellars that were too warm would sprout and become inedible. Medieval people learned these skills through years of practice, starting in childhood, making mistakes and learning from them until preservation techniques became second nature. Herbal medicine represented another area of sophisticated traditional knowledge. Medieval people couldn't cure diseases in the way modern medicine can, but they knew many plants that provided genuine medical benefits. Willow bark, containing natural compounds similar to modern aspirin, reduced fever and pain. Chamomile calmed digestive upset and promoted sleep. Yarrow helped stop bleeding. Mint settled stomachs. Countless other plants provided remedies for common ailments, remedies that, while limited compared to modern medicine, were better than nothing and sometimes genuinely effective. Beyond recognizing medicinal plants, medieval herbalists understood how to prepare them properly. They knew which plants needed to be dried, which should be used fresh, which parts of each plant contained useful compounds, and how to extract those compounds through boiling, steeping, or other processes. This knowledge, accumulated over generations through careful observation and experimentation, represented genuine empirical science even if medieval people didn't think of it in those terms. Building and maintaining shelter required extensive practical knowledge that modern people, accustomed to hiring specialists for construction and repair, have largely lost. Medieval peasants knew how to select trees for timber, when to cut them, how to season wood to prevent warping and cracking. They knew how to build walls from wattle and daub, weaving flexible branches between upright posts and then plastering the gaps with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung that dried into surprisingly durable walls. They knew how to thatch roofs with reeds or straw, layering them in patterns that shed water while allowing smoke to escape. Weather prediction, crucial for agricultural societies, relied on observations of natural signs that modern people with access to detailed forecasts rarely notice. Medieval farmers watched cloud patterns, felt changes in wind direction, observed animal behavior, and noted plant responses to forecast coming weather with surprising accuracy. They knew that certain cloud formations meant rain within hours, that when cattle lay down in fields a storm was approaching, that when birds flew low insects had descended in response to falling air pressure that preceded rain. These countless pieces of traditional knowledge, woven together, created a comprehensive understanding of how to survive in the medieval world. Modern people, despite our advanced technology, have lost most of this knowledge because we don't need it. We buy preserved food rather than making it. We take medicine prescribed by doctors rather than gathering herbs. We hire contractors rather than building our own homes. We check weather apps rather than reading natural signs. A modern person in the medieval world would lack not just the physical adaptations that medieval people developed through lifetimes of hard living, but also the knowledge base that made survival possible. Even with the best intentions and strong determination, ignorance of which plants were edible, how to preserve food, when to plant and harvest, how to maintain shelter, and thousands of other practical matters would leave you dependent on others and vulnerable to mistakes that could prove fatal. Perhaps the most important factor in medieval survival was one that modern people couldn't replicate, even with the best preparation. Medieval people adapted to their world gradually, starting from infancy, their bodies and minds shaped by the environment they lived in. This lifelong adaptation created people who were fundamentally different from modern humans in ways both obvious and subtle. Children in medieval times began learning survival skills almost as soon as they could walk. By age 3 or 4, they helped with simple household tasks, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, carrying small amounts of water. By age 7 or 8, they worked in fields during harvest, carded wool, helped care for younger siblings. By their teenage years, they performed adult labor, their bodies hardened by years of gradually increasing physical demands. This gradual conditioning built strength, endurance, and work tolerance that would be impossible to develop suddenly as an adult. The calluses that protected medieval hands from blisters formed over years of work, layer by layer. The muscular development that allowed heavy labor developed progressively as children grew, their bodies adapting to increasing demands. The cardiovascular fitness needed for long days of physical activity built gradually through constant movement. Immune systems also adapted through constant exposure to pathogens. Medieval children encountered bacteria, viruses, and parasites from infancy onward. Many children died from these exposures, their immune systems unable to develop resistance fast enough. But those who survived, who lived through childhood diseases and infections, developed immunity that helped protect them in adulthood. Modern people, raised in sanitized environments, lack these hard-won immunities and would be vulnerable to infections that medieval people's bodies had learned to fight. Perhaps more important than physical adaptation was psychological adaptation. Medieval children never knew a world where hunger wasn't a possibility, where illness didn't regularly kill neighbors and family members, where life was easy or comfortable. They formed expectations based on reality around them. They learned to find satisfaction in simple things, to accept suffering as normal, to value community and faith more than individual comfort. This psychological framework made medieval hardships bearable in ways that modern people would struggle to replicate. When you've never experienced abundant food, constant hunger is unpleasant but not torturous. When you've never known modern medicine, the death of children from disease is tragic but not inexplicable. When you've never enjoyed modern comforts, living without them doesn't feel like deprivation. Medieval people weren't tougher than modern people in some inherent way. They simply had expectations calibrated to their world rather than ours. Children also learned the traditional knowledge needed for survival by watching and imitating adults from their earliest years. A girl watching her mother spin wool didn't receive formal instruction, but absorbed technique through observation and practice over years. A boy working alongside his father in fields learned the rhythm of agricultural work, the signs of weather changes, the proper care of tools and animals through daily experience rather than deliberate teaching. This immersive, lifelong learning created deep, intuitive knowledge that couldn't be replicated through books or even intensive training. The gradual nature of medieval adaptation highlights perhaps the most fundamental reason why modern people wouldn't last in that world. It's not that we're weaker or less capable than our ancestors. Rather, we're adapted to a completely different environment through our own lifelong conditioning. Our strengths lie in areas that would be useless in medieval times. Our weaknesses show up in places where medieval people were strong. A medieval person transported to modern times would struggle just as badly as we would in their world, overwhelmed by technology they didn't understand, paralyzed by choices they'd never had to make, lost in a social environment that bore no resemblance to the tight-knit communities that structured their lives. Neither modern people nor medieval people are superior. We're simply profoundly different, each adapted to our own time and place. Beyond practical adaptations and survival skills, medieval people possessed something that helped them endure hardships that would break modern spirits. They lived within a comprehensive religious framework that gave meaning to suffering and offered hope beyond the difficulties of earthly existence. This faith, central to medieval psychology, provided crucial psychological support that helped people continue living even when life seemed unbearable. The Catholic Church dominated medieval European life in ways that modern people, accustomed to secular society, struggle to comprehend. Every village had a church that served as the community's focal point. Church bells marked the hours and called people to worship. Religious festivals structured the year, providing breaks from labor and opportunities for celebration. Christian doctrine shaped how people understood every aspect of existence from birth to death and beyond. This religious framework taught that earthly suffering was temporary and relatively unimportant compared to eternal salvation. Pain, hunger, loss, all the hardships of medieval life could be understood as tests of faith or punishments for sin or simply the inevitable consequence of humanity's fallen nature. Either way, suffering had meaning beyond itself. It could purify the soul, build character, earn God's favor, or demonstrate devotion. When a child died, as children so often did in medieval times, faith offered comfort that modern secular psychology cannot replicate. The child, if baptized, had gone to heaven, escaping earthly suffering for eternal joy. The parents would see their child again after their own deaths. The loss was temporary, the separation brief in the context of eternity. This belief didn't eliminate grief but made it bearable, placed it within a framework that offered ultimate consolation. When harvests failed and famine loomed, religion provided both explanation and hope. Perhaps God was punishing the community for collective sins. Perhaps he was testing their faith. Either way, prayer, repentance, and proper observance of religious rituals could restore his favor. Communities came together in churches to pray for deliverance, to confess sins, to pledge better behavior. These shared religious experiences strengthened social bonds, while giving people a sense that they had some agency, some ability to influence their fate through spiritual means. Saints and relics offered more personal, immediate connections to divine power. Every region had patron saints believed to offer special protection. Saints were invoked for specific purposes: Saint Anthony for lost objects, Saint Sebastian for protection from plague, Saint Margaret for safe childbirth. Relics, physical remains or possessions of saints, were believed to carry miraculous power to heal, protect, or bless. These beliefs gave people concrete spiritual resources they could appeal to when facing dangers that had no practical solution. The promise of an afterlife where the faithful would enjoy eternal reward provided perhaps the most powerful psychological support. Medieval life was hard, but it was also short. Most people died before age 50. Many died much younger. Rather than viewing early death as tragedy, religious faith framed it as transition to something better. The poor peasant who suffered through decades of labor and deprivation would, if he died in good standing with the church, enjoy paradise forever. This belief made present suffering not just bearable but almost welcome as the price of admission to eternal joy. Modern people, even those with religious faith, rarely experience the comprehensive, unquestioning certainty that characterized medieval belief. We've been exposed to competing worldviews, to scientific explanations for phenomena that medieval people attributed to God, to doubts that medieval people rarely entertained. A modern person transported to medieval times might try to adopt their faith, might recognize its psychological value, but would struggle to achieve the deep, instinctive belief that made suffering meaningful for medieval people. Without that faith, without the framework it provided for understanding hardship, a modern person would face medieval suffering as meaningless torment rather than purposeful trial. Each death would be senseless tragedy rather than God's plan. Each hunger pang would be pointless pain rather than spiritual test. Each loss would be random cruelty rather than divine justice. The psychological burden of suffering without meaning would compound all the physical challenges of medieval life. Medieval people survived their brutal world through a combination of factors that worked together to make the seemingly impossible possible. Strong community bonds ensured that no one faced hardships entirely alone. Deep traditional knowledge provided practical tools for dealing with challenges. Gradual adaptation from childhood built bodies and minds suited to medieval demands. Religious faith gave meaning to suffering and hope beyond present difficulties. None of these factors alone would be sufficient. A modern person with strong faith, but without practical knowledge, would still starve. Someone with traditional skills, but without community support, would still be overwhelmed by the scope of challenges. Physical conditioning without psychological adaptation would still leave someone broken by the grinding nature of medieval existence. Together, these elements created a survival strategy that worked for medieval people but would be nearly impossible for modern people to replicate. We cannot suddenly develop lifelong physical adaptations. We cannot instantly acquire knowledge that takes years to learn. We cannot easily adopt unquestioning faith. We cannot force ourselves into medieval communities as accepted members. Understanding how medieval people survived doesn't change the fundamental truth that we, as modern people, wouldn't last in their world. But it does help us appreciate the remarkable resilience and capability of our ancestors who lived and even thrived under conditions we would find unbearable. Let us move now to explore specific aspects of medieval daily life that further illuminate why this world would defeat modern people. Moving deeper into the medieval world, let us examine the specific daily experiences that would slowly erode your will to survive. These aren't dramatic disasters or terrible crises, but rather the grinding, repetitive difficulties that would fill every day, wearing away your spirit like water wearing away stone. Modern people, accustomed to flipping switches and flooding rooms with light, rarely experience true darkness. Streetlights illuminate outdoor spaces. Indoor lighting turns night into day whenever desired. Even in power outages, flashlights and battery-powered devices provide adequate light. The medieval world knew nothing of these luxuries, and the darkness of medieval nights would affect you in ways both practical and psychological. As the sun set each evening, productive work largely ceased. Artificial lighting existed but was expensive and inadequate. Candles, made from animal fat or beeswax, provided weak, flickering light that barely illuminated small areas. A single candle might cost a significant portion of a day's wages for a laborer, making casual use impossible. Most peasant families owned few candles, if any, reserving them for genuine emergencies or special occasions. Rushlights, cheaper than candles, served as the primary lighting for poor households. These simple devices consisted of rushes or reeds soaked in animal fat that burned when lit. A rushlight provided dim, smoky light for perhaps 20 minutes before burning out and needing replacement. The light was weak enough that close work like sewing or reading was difficult even when holding the rushlight nearby. The smoke and smell added to the general unpleasantness of medieval indoor air. In practice, most people simply accepted darkness after sunset. They went to bed soon after dark, sleeping longer in winter, when nights were longer, rising at dawn to begin work again. This pattern, dictated by the availability of light, meant that winter days were short and winter nights were long, endless hours of darkness with little to do except sleep or huddle by the fire talking quietly to family members. The psychological impact of spending half your life in darkness or near darkness would be profound. Modern people suffer from seasonal affective disorder when winter days shorten and natural light decreases. Imagine that effect intensified many times over, lasting for months, with no bright indoor lighting to compensate. Depression would creep in, sapping your energy and motivation even beyond what the physical challenges of medieval life already demanded. Darkness also brought practical dangers. Moving around at night, whether inside your house or outside in the village, meant navigating in nearly complete darkness. Every step risked tripping over objects, running into walls, or stepping in waste that had accumulated in streets. Inside houses, open fires posed constant danger to anyone moving around in darkness. Children, animals, and adults all faced risks from burns, falls, and other accidents caused by inability to see properly. Modern people rely on light for security as well as visibility. Darkness feels unsafe, potentially threatening. Medieval people, accustomed to darkness from childhood, developed different psychological responses, but even they understood that night brought increased vulnerability. Criminals and wild animals operated under cover of darkness. Houses were locked and barred at sunset. Communities imposed curfews in many places, requiring people to stay indoors after dark. The cumulative effect of living in a world where darkness dominated half your existence would wear on you gradually. The inability to work or read or do anything productive for long hours would feel like wasted time to modern people accustomed to filling every hour. The depression induced by constant darkness would make all other challenges seem worse. The practical dangers would add another layer of stress to an already difficult existence. Modern people, bombarded constantly by entertainment options from streaming services to social media to video games, rarely experience genuine boredom. When we have free time, we fill it with chosen diversions. Medieval people, with no electronic entertainment and very limited other options, lived with a level of monotony that modern people would find psychologically crushing. For the vast majority of medieval people, literacy was non-existent. They couldn't read books even if books had been available and affordable, which they weren't. The few books that existed were hand-copied manuscripts, extremely expensive, owned only by churches, monasteries, and the wealthiest nobles. Even many nobles were illiterate, relying on scribes and priests to handle any necessary reading and writing. Without access to written entertainment, medieval people relied on oral traditions. Stories, songs, and poems passed from generation to generation, memorized and performed rather than written down. Traveling minstrels brought news and entertainment to villages, performing for whatever payment people could afford. Religious festivals featured mystery plays that dramatized biblical stories, providing both spiritual instruction and entertainment. These entertainments, while meaningful to medieval people, occurred rarely. Most days offered no entertainment beyond whatever conversation and socializing happened naturally during work or in the evening. Modern people, accustomed to constant stimulation, would find the endless sameness of medieval days almost unbearable. The same work, day after day, season after season, year after year, with only occasional breaks for festivals or celebrations. Games and sports provided some diversion. Villages had traditional games, ball games, wrestling, archery practice. Taverns offered dice, cards, and other gambling games. But these activities required free time and energy that working people rarely had. After a full day of agricultural labor, most people were too exhausted for active recreation. They ate their evening meal and went to bed, conserving their energy for the next day's work. The psychological impact of this monotony would compound the physical challenges of medieval life. Humans need mental stimulation, variety, novelty. Without it, we become depressed, listless, unable to find motivation or meaning. Modern people facing medieval monotony would struggle not just with boredom, but with a deeper sense that life had become meaningless routine without purpose beyond bare survival. Medieval people found meaning through community, family, and faith. They valued stability and tradition rather than novelty and change. Their expectations, formed by medieval reality, accepted monotony as normal. But you, carrying memories of abundant entertainment and constant variety, would experience medieval monotony as psychological torture that made every day feel longer and harder than it already was. Modern people, especially those living in developed nations, take privacy for granted. We have private bedrooms, sometimes private bathrooms, spaces we can retreat to when we want to be alone. We can close doors, block out the world, control who has access to our personal space. Medieval people, especially peasants and laborers who formed the vast majority of the population, lived without any meaningful privacy, and this constant lack of personal space would affect modern people deeply. A typical peasant family, perhaps consisting of parents, several children, and possibly elderly grandparents, lived in a one- or two-room dwelling. Every activity from cooking to eating to sleeping to intimate relations occurred in the same shared space. Children were conceived, born, and grew up witnessing every aspect of adult life. Privacy for personal matters simply didn't exist. Sleeping arrangements reflected this lack of space. Multiple people shared beds, children piled together, sometimes multiple generations in the same bed for warmth. Individual beds for each person represented wealth that peasants couldn't afford. The bed itself might be a simple straw mattress on the floor, or a raised platform filled with straw, or in the poorest households simply a pile of straw with some cloth or animal skins for covering. Personal possessions, the few that people owned, were stored in common areas or in simple chests if the family was fortunate enough to own such furniture. Nothing was private. Children handled their parents' possessions. Siblings shared clothes and tools. The concept of my space, or my things, that modern people value had little meaning in medieval households where survival depended on sharing limited resources. Beyond the home, village life offered no more privacy. Houses were built close together. Windows, often simply holes in walls covered by shutters rather than glass, allowed neighbors to see and hear what happened inside. Village streets were narrow. People knew their neighbors intimately, saw them daily, worked alongside them, celebrated and grieved with them. Reputations mattered intensely because escape from judgment was impossible. Even bodily functions occurred without privacy. Toilets as modern people know them didn't exist. People used chamber pots indoors at night, emptying them in the morning. During the day, they used outhouses or simply found a spot away from houses to relieve themselves. Bathing, the rare times it occurred, happened in common rooms with family members present. Menstruation was managed with rags that were washed and reused, with little ability to hide this natural function from family members. For modern people accustomed to privacy as a fundamental right, the medieval lack of personal space would feel claustrophobic and oppressive. The inability to ever be truly alone, to ever escape observation and judgment, to ever have moments of complete solitude would create constant psychological stress. You would feel exposed, vulnerable, unable to process emotions or thoughts privately. The pressure of constant social presence would exhaust you mentally even while physical labor exhausted you physically. Medieval people, never having known privacy, didn't miss it in the way you would. They formed their identities within community rather than as separate individuals. They found security in constant company rather than feeling constrained by it. But you, formed by modern individualism and accustomed to controlling access to your personal space, would experience the loss of privacy as a wound that never healed, a constant reminder of everything you had lost. Perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval life was the profound lack of control people had over their circumstances. Modern people, accustomed to influencing outcomes through planning, effort, and access to resources and information, would find the helplessness of medieval existence almost impossible to bear. Weather determined whether crops succeeded or failed, whether families ate or starved. Medieval people couldn't check forecasts weeks in advance, couldn't plan effectively for coming conditions. They planned it according to traditional timing and hoped that rain would fall when needed but not too much, that frost would hold off until after harvest, that storms wouldn't destroy crops. When weather didn't cooperate, they suffered the consequences without any ability to prevent or mitigate disaster. Disease struck randomly, killed seemingly healthy people while sparing others who seemed weaker. Medieval people had no understanding of germ theory, no ability to prevent the spread of infection, no treatments for most illnesses. Whether you lived or died from disease often seemed arbitrary, dependent on factors beyond human control or comprehension. This randomness, this inability to protect yourself or your loved ones through knowledge and action, would create constant anxiety for modern people used to medicine that works and doctors who can explain and treat illnesses. Social and political events shaped lives without any input from ordinary people. Lords made decisions that affected their peasants' lives without consulting them. Kings went to war, requiring peasants to fight or to pay taxes to support campaigns they had no voice in. Laws changed according to the whims of rulers. Justice was arbitrary, influenced more by wealth and status than by actual guilt or innocence. Medieval people had no vote, no representation, no voice in the systems that controlled their lives. Even personal planning was complicated by uncertainty. A young person couldn't choose their occupation freely, but rather usually followed their parents' trade or the opportunities available in their village. Marriage often involved practical arrangements made by families rather than personal choice based on affection. Where you lived, what work you did, who you married, how many children you had, all of these fundamental life decisions were constrained by circumstances largely beyond your control. Modern people, raised to believe in personal agency and individual choice, would struggle terribly with medieval helplessness. The inability to plan effectively, to control outcomes through effort and knowledge, to protect yourself and your family through available resources would create constant frustration and anxiety. Every day would remind you that you were subject to forces you couldn't influence, vulnerable to disasters you couldn't prevent, trapped in circumstances you couldn't escape. Medieval people developed psychological strategies for coping with this lack of control. Religious faith explained misfortune as God's will and promised ultimate justice in the afterlife. Fatalism accepted that some things couldn't be changed and must simply be endured. Strong community bonds provided support when individual agency failed. These coping mechanisms worked for people raised within medieval culture, but modern people, carrying different psychological frameworks, would find it nearly impossible to adopt medieval acceptance of powerlessness. The combination of helplessness and knowledge would be particularly torturous. You would know that diseases could be prevented and treated with modern medicine. You would know that agricultural yields could be improved with modern techniques. You would know that political systems could be more just and representative. But in the medieval world, you would have no access to any of these solutions, no ability to implement knowledge that could alleviate suffering. The gap between knowing what could be done and being unable to do it would create psychological torment that medieval people, lacking such knowledge, never experienced. The daily realities of medieval life, individually manageable for people adapted to them from childhood, would accumulate into an overwhelming burden for modern people thrust unprepared into that world. The darkness of long nights would depress you. The monotony of limited entertainment would bore you into despair. The lack of privacy would make you feel constantly exposed and vulnerable. The absence of control over your circumstances would fill you with helpless anxiety. These psychological challenges, combined with the physical challenges we explored earlier, the poor hygiene, inadequate nutrition, grinding labor, constant illness, and harsh climate, would create a total experience that would break even the strongest, most determined modern person. It's not one thing that would defeat you, but rather everything together. The accumulated weight of daily existence in a world so fundamentally different from the one that shaped you. Medieval people weren't stronger or tougher than modern people in any inherent sense. They simply lived in the only world they knew, adapted to it from birth, and developed the physical, mental, and spiritual tools needed to survive within it. We, as modern people, have adapted to our own world, developed our own strengths, created our own coping mechanisms. Neither adaptation makes one group of people superior to the other, but the adaptations are so fundamentally different, shaped by worlds so profoundly unlike each other, that moving between them would be nearly impossible without the gradual adjustment that only time and circumstance can provide. As you drift off tonight, let these glimpses into the past remind you of the vast tapestry of human experience. Our ancestors survived challenges we can barely imagine, displaying resilience and capability that demands our respect and admiration. At the same time, we've built a world that, for all its problems, has eliminated many forms of suffering that once seemed inevitable. Rest well, knowing that you live in a time when warm homes, adequate food, effective medicine, and countless other comforts make life easier than any generation before us could have dreamed. Sleep peacefully, and let gratitude for the present mingle with respect for those who endured the brutal past.